Doing the talk from Sunday, which was on Psalm 8, Hebrews 2, so it presumes you've got access to the Bible and can follow those two. Started with an illustration, which is the arrow in flight. It's just a photograph of an arrow and it's high speed going somewhere. And the question is, from what you can see, you have to determine a narrative of how it's in flight, who fired it, why, and what sort of target it's travelling towards. So good possibilities are, is it a hobbyist with an archery set and a target? Is it a hunter shooting at prey? Or it could actually be combat. Is it a soldier shooting at a human target? Interesting questions. All of those are reasonable suggestions. Or you could conclude that arrows sometimes just fly by themselves, although clearly they don't. The point of this illustration, it comes from Thomas Aquinas, actually, the Franciscan monk. The point is that when you see an arrow in flight, it suggests purpose. It's going towards a target. It's been aimed at something. It's been aimed at something by someone. So it implies, it's been launched, and you just can't tell from looking at the image. So you need to look outside the frame to actually get the full picture of who has fired it and why. The answer just can't be found by looking at the photo. Psalm 8 is from David, and he is asking a question that is very similar to this picture of the arrow. He's looking at mankind in the universe and just asking, how are we in motion? What is the purpose, and who has put us in flight? And the answer, similar to David, he cannot answer it himself. He needs an answer from outside. So he's addressing this psalm to God. He clearly observes we're going somewhere, and in Psalm 8 we read the verse 3. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? So he's saying that, we're tiny in comparison to the universe, but when you look at all the other creatures on the planet, we occupy this amazing position. So why has God put us in this position, rulers over the land and sea? So the two questions David's really asking there is, first of all, what is man? And secondly, what's so special about man? What is our value? And he's right to ask, when you think about it, it's an important question. If you look at how many species there are actually on the planet, we are so different to all of them. There's estimated to be more than 8 million species, but there's not a single one of them outside of humanity that you can have a conversation with. And we have got to the top of the food chain, but we're not just super hunters. We're not capable of just advanced survival techniques that, say, evolution might explain, but we have poetry, we have music, we have humour, but also even stranger things like the ability to awe, to wonder, to ask deep questions, and even to have a desire to worship. We will follow leaders, and we do want to know who our Creator is. All of those more advanced senses, even atheists will ask questions why that is. Now, you note that the psalmist David is addressing God, so he's just assuming God exists. In the more modern context, that is not acceptable to a lot of people. They won't accept that God exists. But even so, the two questions really do demand a great answer. Who are we? What are we worth? And the answer that we come up with has to be a good answer. There's no point just coming up with a bad answer, which is similar to the example of the arrow in flight. You just can't say the arrow is flying itself. It makes no sense. So you need a good answer. And you shouldn't be stopping searching for that answer until you've got a good answer. The strategy of the world today is to actually stop us from asking those good questions. So the purpose of this talk is to use the Bible to look for those answers. And later you might be wondering, why would we even look at the Bible? Why would we trust what the Bible has to say? I've got a bit later on that endorses the biblical view. So when we turn to the Bible, there's two people in particular that are going to help us to understand what is a man. And the first is Adam. And we first meet Adam, of course, in the first book of the Bible in Genesis. And what we get from the creation story is that mankind is the pinnacle of creation. and it's special. And the specialness derives from this verse in Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. So the point about being made in God's image is crucial. And what does it mean? It means we share some of God's attributes. Obviously, we cannot create things out of nothing, so we're not omnipowerful, omnipresent. We don't know everything. There's limits to our knowledge, and we're not omnipresent, which is God is everywhere. We're certainly limited in time and space, but we do have a rational mind. We do have a moral conscience. We can perceive right and wrong and make judgments about it. We are relational, similar like God has a relationship within the Trinity. We desire relationships with each other. And we also have authority. Just as God has authority, we've been delegated authority, but clearly with limits. And that authority is explained in Genesis 2, where he gives us the task of being stewards over creation and naming the animals. Just a bit more on the human value that's derived from this essential quality. Bearing the image of God is an enormous value, because what it means is that it makes it a moral outrage to mistreat another human, because it becomes an affront to God himself. It's a fundamental concept that Jesus really picked up on in the so-called golden rules: doing unto others, treating, loving your enemies, and so on. And the culture that he was in really was a radical idea where the strong just decimated the weak all the time. Jesus is saying that that's no good. In Western civilization, we see some of the better aspects of what we're doing there in our civilization: human rights, freedoms, fair trials. All of these aspects are founded on this essential respect for humanity based on it carrying the image of God. The opposite is worth listening to or considering for just a second, because to deny the humanity of others is almost like unlocking a key that gets you permission to some of the worst cruelty in history. We're talking genocides, war, slavery, all forms of racism. They're largely based on not respecting other humans. In the 19th century, there were new philosophers coming up with ideas that were to do with abandoning the idea of God having this image. So thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, who popularized an idea that God is dead, consequently that there is no basis for morality, that the strong should destroy the weak, that it was their moral duty to in fact do so. And you can draw a line from that thinking to some of the worst carnage of the 20th century. You think the Nazis, you think Stalinists, you think Mao and the Cultural Revolution in China and Pol Pot. All of that industrial killing was the result of the leaders determined to break free from the shackles of compassion and empathy. So the idea that any humans had any essential worth was anathema, and they certainly would not have considered that there was a just God watching it all. So that was the last century. In the new century, we see different problems, but have a similar foundation. So we've got the online world with the internet, and that has a reputation, justly, I think, for fostering some of the most insidious cruelty that is correlating with spikes in anxiety and depression and suicides, online bullying, and cancel culture. It's just from behind your keyboard, the humanity of the person whose ideas you disagree with is easy to forget. So any restraint on verbal attacks is gone when you forget that you're dealing with a human. So it's a modern working out of the problem that Genesis 1 anticipates, and the idea that recognizing that other humans are in the image of God it's amazing that God gave us that barrier way back then. So we see that mankind is pretty great. I had a couple of other slides here. So here's a slide of the Apollo mission, and at the end of creation, God says that it was very good, and because we are very good, made by God, we were capable of things like landing a man on the moon. Not only that, but bringing him back Satellites, the modern technology we have is just amazing. Not only that, we've got here's a slide of Beethoven, who represents high art and music. So some really cool stuff. But the flip side is obviously apparent. So I've got images of here of a field of crosses on the beach of Normandy. So we remember the slaughter of millions during various world wars. We've got a slide here with rainforests completely mass logging. And so the charge to look after our creation and care for it, we're exploiting it and ruining it. And you've got no problem really getting anyone to acknowledge that problems we have today, humans are a massive part of it. It's just a bit more problematic to determine which of the next two statements is more accurate. Would you say that humanity is basically good with unfortunate occasional lapses, or would you say that humanity is basically bad with occasional bright spots of virtue? So again, we look at the Bible because it has a pretty clear position on this. And we learn from the 3rd chapter of Genesis that mankind is fallen and condemned. So sin is real. Its first appearance is really just that it seems so innocuous, a mere eating of fruit. But the eating of the fruit, in contravention to the command given to not, was a statement of dissatisfaction with God's hierarchy. It's a refusal to accept our own limits, and it's a clear breaking of God's command. And by the next few chapters of Genesis, we see all sorts of outrageous things going on. The relationship with God is completely severed. It's a descent into chaos. There's murder, brothers killing brothers, all kinds of perversions and rebellions, cats living with dogs, all of that sort of stuff. As a result of that fall, we fall under God's judgment. We bear various curses, and we are sentenced to die, not only in that generation, but for all generations. And in Romans 5:12, we learn from Paul's writing that sin entered the world through one man, and death through that sin. And in this way, death came to all people because all sinned. So what the Bible calls sin is easily acknowledged, exists, even by atheists. Corporate level, it's almost universally agreed that murder and genocide and environmental destruction are bad. But defining what is evil without reference to an agreed authority like the Bible gets really problematic. Certainly at the individual level, we all think other people are in the wrong and sin, but we forgive ourselves pretty much anything, and any faults that we may concede to, we'll generally minimise and say they're not so bad. Not so bad when you compare it to other people, for example. That leaves us with a question. If sin is so prevalent and we have these problems, what's the hope for the future? Are we able to save ourselves? And you might imagine that you could have hope for a world if it was possible that we could overcome our own failures, both collectively and personally. But you can't begin to fix what you don't think is actually broke. So the universal blindness we have to our own faults is a big problem. The social environment, evolutionists like Dawkins imagine a world that will just evolve to become better. But I think that's a huge leap of faith. The sorts of, we rely on ourselves to come up with technical solutions to environmental problems. I've got a slide here which I think is very good. This is from Gus Spieth, who's an environmental lawyer who wrote, I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science we could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. I think that's a terrific admission there. But even if you could imagine that we could overcome the environment and overcome murderous impulses and some utopia would result, what do you do with the remaining problem of death? Because we all are destined to die, and no one disputes that. And it's even interesting that people have come up with technological attempts to deal with that. So cryogenics, we've got dozens of people, I think, frozen in different locations around the world waiting for future solutions and being brought back to life. We've got other tech heads imagine that you could upload just your brain into the cloud and live electronically in some way. I honestly think these types of hope are just delusional. But is there real hope? Go back to the Psalm 8. It really is wonderfully upbeat. It starts with a expression, "O Lord our God, how majestic is your name in all the earth." And it reflects on the wonder of the heavens and man's place in it. And it ends with, "O Lord our God, how majestic is your name in all the earth." So David, who writes this, rightly recognises God's provision and marvels at everything in God's creation. And his trust in the awesomeness of the Creator allows him to have that optimistic view of the future, despite his awareness of sin and the curse of death. So he has hope, but he doesn't even know the half of it. What is revealed after him that we are witnesses to is just incredible. And that brings us to the second person. And it's in David's own ancestry and promised through the prophets, and that is the Christ. And Christ comes into the world, this is Jesus of Nazareth. And if there's any lingering doubt that the form of mankind is indeed special, we get a massive endorsement of human worth by virtue of the fact that it is in a human form that God takes when he sends the Christ to reveal himself. Now we come to the other passage that was read out, which is Hebrews 2, and that is actually an echo of Psalm 8. It quotes Psalm 8, and it gives us an amazing sort of focus on the question, what is our value to God? And it identifies a problem that is sort of hanging out there. In Psalm 8, it's promised, and Hebrews 2:6 quotes it, "There is a place where someone has testified," Psalm 8, "What is mankind that you are mindful of them? The Son of Man that you care for him. In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to them." So there's a consciousness in Hebrews 2 there that everything isn't quite as David perceives it to be. Not everything is subject. Then the next section goes on. "But we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honour, because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone." And that is the answer. In the person of Jesus, we do see everything fully subject to him. And he's crowned with glory and honour because he suffered death, which seems strange. Where's the glory in the death? But it's through the vindication and the resurrection where he overcomes death and takes his rightful place in heaven, that the glory really is there. Now the Bible goes to a long great detail to emphasize that Jesus was fully human. And when we come to understand the nature of sin and its curse, it becomes apparent the consequences of sin cannot be diverted away from humans, whether it was by animal sacrifice or by God just ignoring it. And we understand that God has an essential characteristic of holiness and justice, and he can't just merely put those characters aside. He can't ignore it. He has to act justly. And so in coming up with a plan to bear the sin through his own Son, he allows it to be done justly. So in Hebrews 2, we read 14 to 15, "He too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death." So it's in sharing their humanity that he's able to overcome the curse of death. Could it have been done any other way? The answer is no, and Paul fleshes this out pretty well in Romans 5:18. That it's absolutely essential for justice that a man take responsibility for this curse. Romans 5:18 says, "Consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people." So the one trespass was Adam, which we looked at, resulted in condemnation. But now we have the one righteous act in Jesus, which gives life to all people. So it couldn't have just been any man, not a regular sinner, but it had to be one outside of our fallen line. Could not have been a man born of a human father. It has to be God's own son and not tainted by individual sin. So the fact is that Jesus was completely alone in history, lived without sin. So God has dealt with our sin by sacrificing his own life. So that goes to the point of how valuable is mankind. So valuable that God did not spare his own self, his own son, in order to achieve his plan to save us. And this is done through the cross, of course. And we look at the cross. I've got a slide here. The other half of Romans 5. For just as through the disobedience of the one man the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of the one man the many will be made righteous. So we are originally created and special, we are fallen and condemned, and we are finally restored through Christ at the cross. So here's this picture of the cross, the sunset and the hills and the silhouettes, and it's just a chance to really survey the cross, as it were, and to reflect on it. And when you do take a moment to think about what happened there, it's just an amazing moment in history where everything comes together. God's justice, God's righteousness in dealing with sin. And that it should be necessary to be this way demonstrates how sinful we really were, because if it was able to be done in any other way, it would have been. But because the price to God is so high, and that he is willing to pay that price, to subject himself to the degradation of the torture, to take God's judgment on himself, and just frankly go through the embarrassing reality of physical death, it's just incredible. And it leaves you wondering, why? It's the big question that was being asked back in Psalm 8. What are we worth? What is man that you are mindful of him? Why would God choose to do this? And the question has a simple one-word answer, and that is love. It's no more, no less. It's simply love. Love, almost by definition, is what God is all about, and it is manifest never better than there in the cross. And we need to see that being the object of God's love is the most privileged position to be in the universe. I previously was just asking, can we really trust the biblical account? What is it, what's the significance of it that we should take it seriously? And the cross offers an insight into that as well, because it's an actual moment in history. That Jesus lived and died and was crucified is beyond credible doubt. No scholar disputes it. The resurrection, of course, is more to be discussed, I guess, but that he was raised from the dead, like the Bible teaches, is consistent with how church history has unfolded since then. The church would not have got off the ground unless the earliest witnesses who testified to this reality were prepared to be martyrs for their faith. Had they not been able to do that, there's no way we would even be talking about this today. So the cross in history and the resurrection establishes beyond doubt that God can be trusted with the remainder of promises that are to be fulfilled. Because the cross is true and the fulfillment of the promises that preceded it, it makes everything that preceded it true. But it also gives us incredible ability to trust in the promises to come. And that is amazing when we consider the future. We have an incredible future to look forward to, a new creation, and a time spent with God. So what are the implications? This is a great passage from Mark. Jesus is asked by a couple of lawyers in 16:17 of Mark 12, whose image is this, holding a coin, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. And that question they had asked was, should we pay tax? And Jesus said to them, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And the point of that passage is that, as we saw earlier, the image that we bear is that of God himself. The coin bears the image of Caesar, so we should give the coin to Caesar, but we bear the image of God, so we should give ourselves to God. And we are commanded to live a life of obedience to God, and we're given a promise of the Holy Spirit to help us persevere and to achieve a lifetime of devotion and freedom from the curse of death, and ultimately life in heaven. I spent a minute just talking about that freedom from that curse of death because there'd been an incident in the news about a family from Parramatta who had suffered this horrific car accident, lost 3 kids. And instead of being incredibly, angry about the drunk driver that killed their 3 children, they gave an account of their faith and their ability to forgive and the confidence that their children were in fact with Christ in heaven. So the assurance that they had from their faith really brought this promise in Hebrews 2 to life, that they should be freed. All of those who had lived their lives held in slavery by their fear of death. That's a living, true thing that we can grasp as people, as this family did out west. The opposite, I guess, is for the non-Christian. What is your response to this passage? The big questions remain. How do you explain the existence of matter or intelligent life? What is our place in the universe? Is there a moral basis to anything? How do you determine what is good or bad? What is our purpose? Is this life really all there is? Are you aware that the spirit of the world wants you to stop asking those hard questions and wants you to be distracted by trivia like money and enjoyment? What does the non-Christian make of the person of Jesus Christ? How do they explain how history has unfolded since then? Can he be ignored? Or is he indeed the Son of God, the Redeemer, the way, the truth, and the life? And that is the big question. The end.